Thank you for joining us for Advancing Humanism in a Red State. We want to welcome Nebraska State Senator Megan Hunt and AHA's Policy and Social Justice Director, Rachel Deutsch.
Good morning. Thank you everyone for being here with us at 11:30 East Coast time at least. So I imagine those of you joining from the West Coast, it's pretty early, but we're grateful y'all took the time this morning to join us. Like Nicole said, I'm sitting down with State Senator Megan Hunt of Nebraska, representing the folks in the great city of Omaha, one of my personal favorites. And she is an openly humanist, atheist member of the state Senate. Thank you so much, Meg, for being with us this morning.
Thank you so much. And, I first want to acknowledge the land where I am today. For thousands of years, this land belonged to the indigenous people, including the Omaha, the Ho-Chunk, the Ponca, and the Santee Sioux here in Nebraska. And I just ask everyone with us today to join me in acknowledging these communities, the elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. And I ask you to be mindful of the trauma that happened here throughout history and continues to happen today. And I'm coming to you from the neighborhood of Dundee and Benson, where I represent District 8 in the Nebraska legislature.
Great, thank you so much for grounding us with that to kick us off. So when I found out that we were having this conversation, I immediately started doing my research. And of course, the first place I went was your Twitter feed, and you did not disappoint. Recently, you tweeted a thread of session highlights. These included ending solitary confinement for pregnant and developmentally disabled people, as well as those living with severe mental illness. It included an update to Nebraska building energy codes. It included wonderful photos of you speaking to a Capitol filled to the brim with abortion rights activists, and so much more. Now, as the title of our session says, we are here to talk about how the heck you get things done in a red state. So let's start there. How'd you and others get some of these wins this session?
Honestly, this is the topic that I'm most obsessed with. I feel really lucky to be able to live in Nebraska because we have a lot of policies that make it difficult or more unwelcoming for people in, historically excluded groups, whether that's non-believers or people of color or LGBTQ people in that community or the disabled, whatever it is. And in Nebraska, we have a very conservative state legislature. We have a very conservative governor. And so anytime that we can get these progressive wins, or even if you don't want to call it progressive, just anything that acknowledges the existence of science, the importance of research, and the importance of having evidence for the policies that we pass, it's honestly intoxicating. And that's why I do what I do, because there's a lot of people in Nebraska and in a community who can't choose to leave. And a lot of people take off. They don't want to live in Nebraska. I get it. But I can stay here and hopefully do something about it. So during our most recent legislative session, we were able to pass legislation that provided some really tangible relief to Nebraskans from COVID-19, especially those who have faced additional hardships with being out of work. I'm really proud that I passed my priority bill this year, which allows people who leave work to care for a sick family member to apply for unemployment. And this is the first time that we've had this in Nebraska. And I introduced the bill with 25 co-sponsors from across the political spectrum. So in Nebraska, something that viewers should know before we go any farther is that we have the only nonpartisan unicameral legislature in the country. And we also have the smallest legislature in the country with just 49 members. So instead of a House and a Senate, we just have the legislature, and there are no official, party lines. We don't have a majority or minority leader. We don't have any caucuses. It's just the 49 of us representing our districts, getting beers, getting lunch, hanging out, fighting, laughing, arguing, and figuring out how we're gonna do something to actually help people in the state. So what I have found is that Nebraska is kind of a special laboratory, if you will, for cross-partisan cooperation, because we don't have any party leadership. So I'm not going to get in trouble if I go have lunch with 12 Republicans, or I'm not going to, have any kind of consequences if I make a compromise with a moderate and, in order to get something that I want for my people. And I wish that that's a culture that other places in the country would emulate. One thing that I've learned in leadership, whether that's through politics or whatever else, is that when you're in a position of authority, people will do whatever they can do to keep you in a place that makes them comfortable. And systems are really good at keeping people from disrupting the status quo. And that's something that a lot of libertarians and a lot of conservatives are frustrated with too. Across the political spectrum in Nebraska, you have a lot of populists, whether it's on the left or the right. They think they're doing what the people want. And we have a lot of pride in our nonpartisan legislature, and we kind of have this independent libertarian streak. And so that's something that I appeal to a lot when I talk to people or when I talk to my conservative colleagues, whatever it is we want to make sure that we're making independent decisions, that we're doing things for the right reasons. And it's probably just those personal relationships that makes it possible.
That's great. Yeah, I think you certainly are a unique microcosm in the country. When I speak to state legislators from other states, I don't think they are able to come to their work as open to the folks that they're working with who maybe are on the other side of the aisle.
Right. And I don't even know what advice to give about that. It's like, in Nebraska, we're definitely getting more partisan. We have a billionaire governor who's personally funding legislative races. He's essentially picking, who's going to be in the other branch of government from him. And he's a very, very conservative guy. And so when someone is that wealthy and that connected and that powerful, it's really hard to stand up against that. And I think it's given us in Nebraska a little bit of a taste of what other states have to deal with in terms of the party power. But, everything starts small. And if that's a conversation or a relationship, you have to keep at it. You really have to keep at it, even if it's frustrating.
Yeah. I think that speaks to something that I've seen you say before. And I'm just going to pull a direct quote, which is, I've heard you say that you believe in a leadership and cooperation that doesn't look at things in partisan terms, that doesn't operate in either or, in left or right. And I think, what you just mentioned about building bridges and building those relationships and starting small, I'm curious if you can walk us through a specific piece of policy and how you did that. Perhaps even the farm to school network that you've championed.
Yeah. So in Nebraska, I can't pass anything without conservatives because we don't have enough votes. The math isn't there. So everything that we're able to accomplish, we have to do across party lines. This year, I worked with a rural state senator named Tom Brandt, and he's wonderful. He sits next to me in the chamber, and he's a great guy. He's a very thoughtful man. He's a farmer, smart guy. He's a father. Like, he's kind of like a father figure to me a little bit. Like, he's fatherly, the type, and just like cares about everybody's well-being. It's like very Midwestern, but he, in his community, he has a lot of other farmers that are really concerned about how they're going to keep their family farms and not have to sell to Smithfield or, any of these big factory farms that aren't even based in the United States in a lot of cases, because people are losing their farms in Nebraska and their ranches. And another thing is we don't have a lot of Black farmers. We don't have a lot of women farmers. And what Senator Brandt found out is that when people have their farm and they can do like a farm to table thing with restaurants, that's been a great way for them to keep their farms going, is by selling produce to restaurants. So several years ago, we passed a law that makes it easier for farms to do that without going through like a super red tapey regulatory process. Basically just having reciprocity. So like, if your produce is good enough to sell to a grocery store, we're going to just assume it's good enough for a restaurant too. So we have now done this for schools, which is going to be great for our school children in Nebraska, because it makes no sense that we live in the nation's breadbasket, but we still have children who suffer from food insecurity. We still have kids who aren't getting healthy meals at school, even though, we grow so much healthy food here in the heartland. So Senator Brandt and I worked on a bill to do like a farm to school pipeline instead of like a farm to restaurant or farm to table. And now schools across Nebraska are getting fresh produce, fresh meat, fresh food every day from our farms here in Nebraska. And that also provides like a really great educational opportunity for these kids. Because, my child, I'm also a single parent to an 11-year-old girl who's amazing. And she's like obsessed with farming now because she's learned about farming in school. But living in Omaha, like we don't have a lot of farms around us. So it's great for that educational piece. It's great to support the farmers. It's great to allow a diverse group of farmers to kind of break into the industry and to keep everything local. And this is something that Republicans thought was great, Democrats thought was great, and he and I were able to work on that and build that together. But also, just to like asterisk that, that's every law in Nebraska, basically. Everything that I work on in Nebraska and have been able to accomplish, I had to have allies who are conservative to get that done.
Great. So in that answer, I heard you talk about agriculture. I heard you talk about education. I heard you talk about food insecurity. And one of the things that I've been really compelled following your career is that your approach is highly intersectional. I don't think I've seen you do anything that isn't thinking about 4 other things and how they work together to, like you said, kind of increase those barriers to historically marginalized communities or frankly excluded groups. And I think some of that probably comes down to how you bring your whole self to your work, which you also talk about very openly. But as a legislator, you also need to be able to translate that into policy for your constituency and for Nebraskans, which you also just touched on. And I just want to emphasize for folks watching that that's really not easy to do. It's not easy to convey in snippy sound bites. It's not easy to implement in policy that's supposed to be really discreet and really focused. But when done well, right, we build stronger coalitions and relationships and those bridges that you mentioned that ultimately makes for more effective policy that reflects our lived realities. Can you walk us through just how you center intersectionality in your work when so many other legislators struggle to? And that includes progressive legislators. I'm not just talking about Republicans in a red state.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really don't do the thing that's like all Republicans are bad or all conservatives are my enemy. I mean, in Nebraska, A, I can't do that. And B, I come from Republicans. Honestly, like my parents are Republicans and they're kind of this like Midwestern type of conservative that they don't hate gay people. They don't hate people of color. They just want their taxes to be lower. And like, that's not my view, but this is just like an extremely common type of Republican that unfortunately, in today's Republican Party is not really what we see mostly in the media and the news and stuff. But, it's everywhere around you here in Nebraska and every red state. And how you center other issues, intersectionality. I mean, it really just is about compassion. And I think that any leader, whether it's a teacher or a clergy member or a neighborhood association person or a lawmaker, whoever you are, you're not going to be a good leader if you're in it for power. You have to be in it to minimize as much unnecessary suffering as possible for the people who don't have the power. And when you think about that every day, you're going to always make mistakes. I have, said ignorant things, and the root of ignorance is just that you're ignorant, like that it's unintentional, like it's because I didn't know. But I try to just be open to knowing and improving and being better and understanding that everybody has their favorite issue. Everybody has an issue that is like life or death for them. And whenever I work on policy, I think about who wins and who loses, who has a sense of loss from this policy. And keep in mind, a sense of loss is the same thing as loss for people. So whether that's a conservative who thinks that their taxes are going to go up, or a progressive who thinks that this is going to lead to more targeting of people of color, or whoever feels like they're getting a loss from a policy, balancing all of that all the time and talking about how everybody has their important favorite issue. The reality is making everything important all the time is really exhausting. Making everything important is exhausting. And we say that we care about everything because we don't want to make choices about values that come into conflict. But keeping in mind that everybody has that issue for themselves and coming to them, whether it's a lawmaker or a constituent or whatever, and saying, here's what I care about. I'm willing to help you with something you care about. If you help me, I know you believe in justice. You know, I want to put that issue in my frame and put that issue in their value set. And, you know, just meet people where they're at and show them how this intersectionality and like combining these issues actually speaks to the moral beliefs that they have. And when you work with people who are very religious, like especially like Christian conservatives, like putting things in their value set has been a great way for me to help them think more intersectionally about issues.
That's great. So I didn't plan this, but I really feel like you're teeing up my questions really nicely. So you mentioned the life or death issue, and you mentioned the loss that comes in policy. And we've also talked a lot about compromising and working across the aisle, but I want to pivot now to kind of an issue that is just highly contested all over the place right now. And it's something that I think a lot of the folks on this call feel very firmly about, which is voting rights.
Yes.
And I think I'm going to tee up this question pretty lengthily because I want folks listening in to really understand the context if they're not familiar. So we all know that the rhetoric of fraud around the last election was unprecedented, but it wasn't surprising. And states are reacting to, or dare I say, capitalizing on that rhetoric to pass partisan, racist voting restrictions. Just 2 weeks ago, we saw some movement on this issue in Nebraska. And for folks not from Nebraska, there was a petition filed to seek a constitutional amendment added to the 2022 ballot, which, if successful, would require voter identification. Excuse me. But this isn't new in Nebraska either. You've had colleagues in the Senate introduce voter ID bills and bills that would change Nebraska's electoral college makeup. And you fought back. You've introduced resolutions just affirming your values very clearly on what is or what should and should not be acceptable in Nebraska for how people are able to access the ballot box. And I guess I want to frame this question not for what you're doing, but really for how advocates on the ground can push back, because we've seen, you know, for a really long time, really effective voting rights activism on the ground. And I think we are just in this pinnacle right now where it's really, really important. So I'm curious ways that you've seen advocates push back successfully against voter suppression laws. And do you have any advice for the folks joining us today that they can use in their states?
That's a tough question. I'll be honest with all of you. Oh, you don't want to hear this, but like, I'm frankly not super optimistic about this fight. Doesn't mean we can't win it. I tend to like run a little pessimistic anyway, but in Nebraska, yeah, we're going to have a voter ID ballot question probably if they can get the signatures, which I have no doubt that they can get the signatures, and it'll probably pass once it gets on the ballot. And again, kind of coming back to the thing I said earlier about ignorance. I talked to so many people one-on-one where it makes sense. You know, the gut check is, well, why don't people just get an ID? I have an ID. Why is it so hard to get an ID? Like, no, I don't like to wait in line at the DMV, but we all have to do it. And if we want to exercise our, you know, civic duty to vote, then you should have to go wait in line like everybody else and get an ID. And okay, like I hear what you're saying. You think that you're doing something that's easy, that everybody else is able to do. But a lot of these folks are ignorant. Like they don't realize in parts of North and South Omaha, which are majority Black and majority Hispanic, they don't have public transportation to get to the DMV. There's no DMV there. Like they have to go out to another part of the city that doesn't have public transportation. So that's an issue. We talk about people who are elderly, who are older. And a lot of times you hear very common stories of, you know, I don't have my birth certificate, or the name they put on my birth certificate was misspelled. And so I had to get a different ID and then I don't have it anymore. Like, it's really not that easy for people actually. And I think that if one person is not able to vote because of this suppressive law, then that is a huge miscarriage of justice and democracy. And that is the frame that we need to be thinking about this in and communicating about this in to supporters of voter ID and other voter suppression issues. Advocates of voter ID say things like, if there's one fraudulent ballot, if one person, then that's too many, and then that's a fraudulent election. But think about it the other way. Like, what if one person can't vote? Why isn't that a fraudulent election? Like, we have races in Omaha, everybody does, where it's like city council or school board or something, and the person wins by like 30 votes. Those votes really matter, and they make a big difference, especially at the local level when we're talking about things like curriculum for students. We're having a lot of battles in schools right now around health education and religious education and all of those things. And if it's 30 votes, how can you say that if 30 people weren't able to go to the polls who are eligible to vote because they don't have an ID, that wasn't a fraudulent election? I'll also say this isn't my wheelhouse. I'm like, when you're a state senator, you have to know a little bit about a million things. But I'm not like a voting rights genius here. And I really just follow the lead of people who have been doing this work on the ground for a long time. And anybody watching who wants to get involved in an issue, whether that's education or reproductive justice or racial justice, incarceration, voting rights, go to the organizations and advocates on the ground who are already doing the work. We really don't have to invent the wheel on this stuff. There have been people for generations who have specialized in this, and they've created really great blueprints and maps for us to follow. So I just consider myself, no matter what the issue, kind of a tool, like a channel through which good policy can flow. I have the privilege of having the seat for now in the legislature. And so I just listen to the experts and the advocates who know better than I do to figure out what to do.
Yes. And yeah, I think that's something we see a lot, right? Like humanist groups or local folks come to us being like, I really want to get involved on this local issue. And I'm like, well, I'm not working in that particular city. And the folks doing the best work, they're going to be the folks on the ground who've been doing that work for years. Go reach out to them. I can help you find their contact information. But the more and I think that also goes back to building bridges, building stronger, larger coalitions.
And that's how those coalitions grow. I mean, my wheelhouse, my issue is reproductive justice. Like, I care, like I said earlier, caring about everything is exhausting. Like, I obviously certainly care about everything touching justice. Like, I want justice for everybody, but I can't be the expert in every single one of those things. That's okay. I'm an expert in reproductive justice. I know a lot about it. This is like my obsession. And so when people have questions about that, I'm the one who needs to be in front leading. But on other issues, I don't need to be the one in front leading. Sometimes I need to be the one who introduces the bill and, organizes the support. But when you volunteer with these organizations, I started volunteering with them when I was a teenager. And so that's how you really build your knowledge and build your experience so that these coalitions can continue to grow and keep forming, and the knowledge gets carried on, through the generations of not just the issue, but the advocacy work and the organizing and how it works and how you can actually be effective.
Yeah. So I want to touch on a little bit about your reproductive justice work, but first I want to go back to something you said at the beginning of your answer, which was about your cynicism, about things not getting done. Because I don't want folks leaving here being like, we can't do that.
I know,
so
sorry.
One, work locally. Two, but it's realistic. And I think we need to come to this work with realism, right? That's the only way we're going to be successful. If we walk around thinking that this is going to be easy or it's going to be done in the next few years, then we'll get burned out way too fast. We won't actually get anything done. We won't build strong, long-lasting coalitions. So I think a dose of realism is really important when we're talking about voter suppression laws. But I want to talk about something that you didn't have a ton of success with if we look at it on paper, but there was a policy to ban conversion therapy, right? So you introduced legislation to ban conversion therapy, and you had held hearings on the subject, and that was unsuccessful at the state level. But the city of Lincoln, Nebraska did enact a ban on conversion therapy, I think, pretty quickly afterwards. And so, there is hope that if something can't happen in one space, it still provides kindling for it to work somewhere else. Can you speak about that effort and where you see opportunities for local governments to lead?
This is a really, really important point, because if we feel like we've had a failure of policy or some effort on the state level or the national level or whatever level, you have to think about the impact that work had that trickles down. It really, really does. And the more local a government is, the more responsive it is to the community. And the city of Lincoln in Nebraska is leading now on LGBTQ equity and showing the rest of the state that when we pass these policies, it actually helps us economically. It attracts, high skill workers. It attracts, the kind of people that we want to have in our communities. And those are people who believe in justice and equity. So more people are willing to speak up in their communities than on the state level. And that's something we really saw in action in the cities after we started working on conversion therapy. So if you don't know, conversion therapy is this like totally debunked, wild practice of trying to change somebody's sexual orientation or gender identity by basically, traumatizing it out of them. So sometimes what they'll do is they'll show you homosexual imagery and then shock you. And so you start to associate that imagery with, negative emotions. And it also, of course, doesn't work. And it just leads to more feelings of depression. People who experience conversion therapy are more likely to attempt suicide. And it's just a really, really bad thing. And so it's been banned in, I think we're up to like 23 states now. When I first introduced the bill, it had only been banned in 13 states. So the movement is really growing. I would really like Nebraska to be next, but all the work that we do at the state level on this, even if it's not successful year to year, it's inspiring the lawmakers at the local level in Omaha, in Lincoln, in Grand Island, in Kearney, all over the state. Local city councils are talking about banning this. And this is going to put pressure on state officials to bring in that change themselves. And the same thing can happen on the large scale. Sorry, this is my dog. When states work on issues, sometimes it puts more pressure on Congress, and that's a real thing too. So don't ever feel like something is a loss just because the law doesn't pass or something, or the thing doesn't happen, because it really does have these branching out effects on people that stays with them and influences them. Another quick example I can share is, around reproductive justice. I work on a lot of proactive abortion bills, but also at the same time, I'm often in a defensive position trying to stop a bad bill in Nebraska. And for example, we had one bill that passed, but the fight was so hard and I made it so hard for them, and I didn't let them get away with it easily. And then the next year, we didn't have any abortion bills because the people who championed those anti-abortion bills were exhausted from me. And it's like, you got your win. Like, you got your little way. You passed your favorite little dumb policy, and you did not lose, but it felt like a loss to them because it was so exhausting and difficult. And so that's a lesson too, why it's so important to keep up the fight.
I love that. Yeah, let's exhaust them. Let's just make it
exhaust them. Yes.
Don't want to get out of bed in the morning sometimes.
It's like you're going to get your way, but you're going to be sorry.
Yeah, you're going to want to set that aside for a few years before you come at our rights again in that particular way. There's other ways to come at our rights. So, I didn't have a specific question about your reproductive justice work, but something that when I look at what you've done, I think we talked about this in tech when we were setting up half hour ago, is you have just the most compelling floor speech about abortion reversals. And I encourage everyone to hop on YouTube after this and go find it, because the way that you brought, passion and ethos into this, but then also what I think a lot of folks on this call are excited about and gets us up in the morning, is that it was so grounded in evidence-based policy and evidence in, you called the hotline that they were going to have folks call. You did the research. You brought up how this would impact Nebraskans in a really compelling, straightforward way. And my question was going to be about, what tools you use to get your colleagues in the Senate to prioritize evidence-based policies. But I'm not really sure if that's the question anymore. So maybe that's part of the question, is what's worked when you're trying to push forward evidence, when we're having these really charged religious political conversations about reproductive justice. But I think, I think the vision there, or the obstacle there, is it's so religious for so many people, and then it's so scientific for others, and it's so bodily autonomy that folks are just talking past each other. So you gave this really compelling floor speech, and folks were just walking past you, not paying attention, and that's just part of legislators and legislatures in general. I understand that.
They're listening. Everyone's working on things.
Yeah, everyone's doing things. I get that. I guess, where have you seen breakthroughs? Where have you been able to break through that? And what obstacles are you almost there on, getting closer? And then what's still completely insurmountable?
There are a lot of factors to that answer. The abortion reversal bill was really interesting and provided kind of a opportunity for reproductive justice advocates, because regardless of how you feel about abortion, everybody should agree that women should not be subjected to experimental procedures that haven't been tested, that could possibly hurt their fertility in the future, that could leave them with medical outcomes that haven't been studied. And that's what this procedure does. So abortion reversal is this concept invented by this quack doctor who isn't even licensed in obstetrics or anything. He's like a palliative care physician or something. And, I looked him up. I looked up, what's your experience? What do you even know about this? What makes you think abortion reversal is even a thing? So he has this theory that if you give a pregnant person, after they terminate their pregnancy, if you give them a shitload of progesterone, untold numbers of progesterone that he doesn't even have a standard amount that you're supposed to take, that you will retain the pregnancy and you will not abort the fetus. When this has been studied, there has been no evidence that there's any difference between taking progesterone and taking a placebo. It could be you take a handful of Skittles and you have the same exact, probability of not having a completed abortion. I don't know, I could get into all the science of it. That's the top level, is that this policy is nonsense. It's nonsense. And furthermore, we don't know the effect of giving shitloads of progesterone to women. How does that affect their future fertility? We don't know. So if you are a person who really cares about the health of mothers, about the health of women and their children, why would you advocate a unstudied, unproven, experimental procedure be put into state statute? Let alone maybe someone consents to an experimental procedure for the purpose of research or something like that. That happens all the time. What we don't do is put that in state statute and say, if a patient chooses to have an abortion and terminate a pregnancy, they have to be told about this experimental procedure. Ridiculous and unsafe. And with this policy, the right thing to do wasn't to make it about abortion, but make it about the lack of evidence and science behind the idea of abortion reversal that could actually harm patients. And that's what got a lot of moderates on my side with me. And at the end of the day, we had a really good argument, but it always just ends up being a math problem. At the end of the day, there were just more adversaries than allies, and people had their minds made up and there was nothing I could say. So that's why I say there's a lot of factors involved. There's people who are open to information and open to reason and evidence, and there's people who just aren't, who have their minds made up. These are your adversaries. And like, let me explain something about adversaries. For them, it's never, ever, ever about the merits. They will do anything to take you down. And you can't have an argument or discussion or anything on the terms of the merits or the evidence, because there are always going to be people who have their mind made up to oppose you. And for me, these people aren't reachable to me. They aren't reachable to me. And I am not the messenger that will reach them. They have to be reachable through other people who are authorities to them, who they trust, who they believe. And so that's, again, why those relationships are so important. Come here. I'm just going to pick up my doggy. This is Cricket, by the way. So yeah, I can't be the person to bring them that message. And that's why building those relationships is so important, because, you know, if they don't want to listen to me, maybe there's a moderate who agrees with my little argument and they can go tell them. Or maybe there's a hospital association or a doctor. You know, one thing I did on that abortion bill, now this is like galaxy brain stuff here. I found out who delivered the children of the opponents to the bill. And I had those obstetricians and doctors contact the senators and say, oh, I'm Dr. Smith who delivered all your kids. You should listen to Megan. And that helped a little bit. But yeah, when we're talking about justice, no matter what the issue is, I feel like there is nothing I won't do at the end of the day to advance that cause, because on the other side, the adversaries, there's nothing they won't do. And sometimes I think progressives or advocates of reason, whatever you want to call yourself, we can be a little bit too nice because we think we're going to be able to convince them with evidence. But there's always going to be a type of person where the evidence just doesn't matter to them. And so to protect the people who are vulnerable, to protect the people who are going to be targeted by these policies, it's a fight, you know, it's a fight you got to be willing to have.
On that note, I think it's time to open it up for Q&A. I have a few more questions. So if we run out of questions, which I don't think we will, I have one more that I'd love to close us with, but Nicole, I'll turn it over to you.
We have about 3 minutes left in this session. So
sorry, everybody, I get so long-winded.
One of the questions from the Q&A session, John Lombard asks, which humanist values do you find it easiest to gain agreement from conservatives and Republicans, and which are most difficult?
I think it's easiest to kind of appeal to the love your neighbor type of thing. You know, whatever policy it is that I'm advocating for, you know, those Midwestern values of taking care of the people around you is something that really has been a shared value for everybody.
Another question from Anson Kennedy. I would imagine trying to advance humanist values in a red state would be an uphill battle. What has been your biggest win and your biggest loss in the state Senate? And is there something you would do differently?
That's a tough question. For me, the biggest one is a little bit personal. You know, I'm an atheist. I'm the only openly atheist person in the legislature. I'm the first out LGBTQ person ever in the Nebraska legislature. I'm a single mom. Like, I have a lot of, on paper, strikes against me in terms of like typical politics. But my colleagues have not been judgmental of me. My colleagues have been open to working with me, and that's really felt like a win. And it's because of that that we were able to do things like this year, make it so that family caregivers could access unemployment, which really helped people during COVID-19 and helped people with family members dealing with disabilities. And that was something that Christian conservatives and I were able to find a lot of common ground on. So anytime there's a time that one of my colleagues surprises me like that, I consider a big win, because it reminds me that I also hold stereotypes like about people who I don't think I have anything in common with, and that, you know, they're great people too, and everybody's doing their best. And if you just trust that everybody means well and is doing their best, it's a lot easier to have success.
Great.
they like getting the benefit of the doubt too. I mean, I want people to respect me. I try to do it to them, and they would probably say the same thing, that like they didn't expect me to be nice to them or something. And yeah, wherever you are in life, I think that that's helps a lot.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful session. We had lots more questions in the Q&A, and staff, AHA staff will try to get to the ones that we can answer.
I will also say,
thank you.
I'm very accessible. If anybody wants to follow me on social media, I'm Nebraska Megan on everything. Just send me a tweet or a message and I'll answer your question there too. And I'd be happy to share it as well if you let me.
Wonderful. Thank you. That would be wonderful. Thank you to both Meg and Rachel for this very fascinating discussion. We appreciate you joining us.